Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to be talking about plane names. In other words, let's start an argument. When it comes to naming tools, people often are invested in a particular name, and some arguments tend to break out over that. But the truth of the matter is, for any one of these, there are 5 to a dozen different names that can fit it in English. And then you go into another language and there's 5 to a dozen different names in that language, because different traditions over the years have named them different things. And a lot of the names are kind of gray. They may refer to a bunch of different planes, or they might refer to a specific plane. And so I want to kind of go through this and talk through what names are specific, what names are broad, and what falls in and out of the particular categories. Now, when it comes to bench planes, a lot of times people refer to them by the number. It's a 4, it's a 3, it's a 4.5. And that can be very, very useful because that refers to a very specific size measured out by Stanley, a certain length, a certain width. That is a very specific name to it. However, other companies had different numbering systems and might have slightly different measurements, but in general we stick with the Stanley numbering when we're going to be calling out a specific plane. On top of that, Stanley went and confused a few people by giving specific planes a specific name. They referred to the 4 as the smoother, they referred to the 5 as the jack, and each plane had a specific name issued to it. But in other traditions and other places, that name was kind of a broad category that might fit several planes, and so arguments ensued, as that's what hand tool people like to do. I have an entire video dedicated to the specific numbers so you can see them all, 1 through whatever. So if you want to see that, go over there. Today we're going to be looking at the names. With the bench planes, the most common one you're going to see is the smoother. It's kind of like the planes. However, smoother is a term, not as much a name. Yes, this is a smoothing plane. It is a smoother. However, this is a smoother, and this is a smoother, and this is a smoother. It has more to do with how the plane is set up and how it's used than the actual specific size and shape of it. A smoothing plane is a plane that is set up with a very fine mouth, a very fine shaving, a very sharp edge, chip breaker close to the edge. All those things come together to make a really good smoother. And you can put that in whatever size you want. You can smooth with any plane. Generally, the smoother is something smaller rather than larger. And the one that fits kind of closely into the middle of the bucket is the number 4. It's generally what most people would consider to be the quintessential smoother. However, a lot of people love the 4.5. A lot of people love the 3. They're all smoothers if you set them up that way. Next up the line is the jack plane. It is the jack of all trades when it comes to planes. And this one is a little bit more specific. Generally, most of the time, it refers to the number 5. Though sometimes it can refer to the 5.25 or the 5.5. Generally, if you say jack plane, you're referring to the number 5, though it can vary a little bit. I have talked to 2 people in particular who are adamant that the jack plane is the number 4 because it's the plane that can do everything, not the number 5. Again, arguments. Next, we're going to get really confusing and move up the chain to the 4 plane. Not the number 4, but the 4 plane. In other words, the plane that comes before all the others. Generally, it's going to be a 5, 5.5, 6, somewhere in that range. It's pretty vague. Some people will use a 4.5, some people will go all the way up to a 7. A 4 plane tends to be a little bit larger plane. But a 4 plane is a term for how it's used, not the exact plane. It's kind of like the big brother to the scrub plane. It has a cambered iron on it, and generally I use a number 5 as a 4 plane, and I'll put a cambered iron on there. Not quite as vigorous as I would have on my scrub plane, but it is called the 4 plane because it comes before all the planes. In other words, it's the plane that scrubs the wood down and gets it flat, and then the other planes make it smooth. So a 4 plane is the first plane to touch the wood, which can get kind of confusing because often the first plane to touch the wood is the scrub plane. But we'll get to that one in a minute. Then all the way down this end, we have the jointer, or the joiner, or the joiner, or the jointer. Yeah. Do you join with a jointer, or do you joint with a jointer? Yeah, it is generally the biggest plane in the list. This is a number 8, which is a very, very large plane, 24 inches long, mondo wide. It's the big beast. Though generally the 6, or even the 5.5, the 7, those are all jointers. A jointer is a plane that you joint a board with. So yeah, that is another name that is indicative of what it's doing, not exactly a specific plane. But most commonly, if you talk about a jointer, you're going to be talking about a 7 or an 8, though some people will throw the 6 into that, and you kind of get a gray area there. You may notice I didn't refer to any low-angle planes in here, and that's because they're kind of a new concept. They are something that is developed for the power tool mindset or the hybrid woodworker. And they're commonly referred to as a low-angle jack because they're the exact same form factor as a jack plane, but they have the low-angle bevel-up iron. Stanley did make these for a long time. They just didn't make very many of them. They weren't very common because they weren't used that much. They were basically designed for flattening the top of butcher blocks where you have a lot of end grain coming up. That is where these really sing and are amazing. Though nowadays people like to make others low-angle, but then you start getting into other confusions about what they are. You can't have a low-angle smoother, though it doesn't do the same things that these smoothers would do, but it's still a smoother. So yeah, names are very, very fluid. So let's speed things up a little bit and add a few others in here. A block plane. It's usually smaller than a number 2 or a number 3. It doesn't have a tote. It is often intended as a one-handed plane, though you can pinch it with the other hand. And similar to it, they do get really small. Like this is a block plane, but this is a specific type of a squirrel tail block plane. It has this squirrel tail on the back. It's intended to be rested in the palm, and it's a much smaller surface so you can go around curves better. You see these a lot in the luthier world. The scrub plane. Ooh. Yeah, this is actually kind of interesting. It's very, very, very thin in comparison to others, but it's about as long as a 4. But it has this really, really massively cambered iron that takes out large chunks very, very quickly. The scrub plane is a very simple tool. There are no adjustments. You adjust everything with a mallet. It's a very dumb tool, but very expensive now because they've kind of become collectible. This is a number 10.5. It is actually a rabbited plane. So anytime you see the iron coming all the way to the outside, that is a rabbit plane. You can get them in all different types. You can get a rabbited block plane. You can get a rabbited jack plane, which is then called a jackrabbit. Kind of fun. But yeah, any plane where the iron comes to the outside is a rabbited or a rabbit plane, though they can come in many different types and sizes. It's called a rabbited plane because it makes rebates, but only if you're on the other side of the pond. A shooting plane or a miter plane. This is one that is kind of interesting because it talks about what it does. It is a plane that shoots, often can be on a shooting board for miters, or shooting board. Yeah, it talks about what it's doing, but it's also referring to a specific plane, and it can be many different shapes. But it's a plane that is dedicated to the art of riding in the groove of a shooting board. Now, a lot of people use a low-angle jack as a shooting plane, and in that case you could probably call it a shooting plane, but in general you probably wouldn't because it's not dedicated to the work. It is something that is put in there that can do it. Yes, you can shoot with any plane, but that doesn't generally make it a shooting plane because it needs the specific characteristics that you wouldn't want to flatten a board with this. You probably could, but it's designed for shooting, so you call it a shooting plane. A compass plane or a circular plane. These can come in wooden body, they can come in wood. These can come in wooden bottle, they can come in metal, they come in all different shapes and sizes, but basically they are set up so that you can adjust the sole and make it concave or convex, and you can actually change the geometry of the plane to fit a curvature or the compass or a round. They come by lots of names, but most common you're going to hear a compass plane. The combination plane. This is the Stanley 55, and it is, ooh. Now, this also comes as a 45 or a 50 or a 46. Some people refer to an old wooden plow plane as a combination plane. It is kind of a broad category of different things, but basically the big difference is that there are a whole bunch of different irons you can put in here to change it to different things. It combines a bunch of other planes into one. Not to be confused with a jack plane, which does a bunch of things in one. This actually can be configured differently. You can move the fences, you can move the skates, you can change its width, you can put different irons in there, you can put different depths. It can do a lot of different things all in one plane. Combinations. From this point on, most planes are basically named by what they can do. It's a rabbet plane, it's a shoulder plane, it's a side rabbet plane. And some of these are fairly straightforward. It is what it cuts. Though some of them are a little confusing, like a moving philoster plane. This actually has moving parts. So basically, it is a shoulder plane or a rabbet plane because the iron comes all the way to the outside, but it has a moving fence and a moving depth stop. Sometimes has a nicker or a spur on there so you can cut cross grain. And that gets a little confusing because Stanley then called this a rabbet plane, which does everything that does. It has a moving fence, it's got a depth stop, it's got a spur or nicker, it's rabbeted. So some people will still refer to this as a moving philoster, though often moving philoster just refers to the wooden body of the exact same thing. But then you come down to the difference between a shoulder plane and a rabbet plane. Now, a rabbet plane can do shoulders, and a shoulder plane can do rabbets. But generally, a shoulder plane is a low-angle, bevel-up plane that is designed for cutting end grain. It cuts the shoulder beside a tenon, whereas a rabbet plane, though it is rabbeted, is designed for cutting rabbets, rebates, that little notch out of the corner of a board. If it has a spur up front, it can be a cross-grain rabbet, or if it doesn't, it's just generally intended for long grain. Unfortunately, at some point I have to draw a line and say we're only going to talk about this many because there are lots of other planes out there. But most of them are then referred to by what they do. So most other planes are pretty obvious. A router plane cuts routes. A grooving plane cuts grooves. A tongue and groove plane cuts tongues and grooves. It's fairly straightforward on that. The most confusing ones are the bench planes because Stanley kind of pigeonholed them into a specific plane, but often they refer to a range of planes, a use, as opposed to a specific size. So if you call this a smoothing plane and another person says, no, this is a smoothing plane, you can say, well, I'm smoothing with this, so doesn't that make it a smoothing plane? And some people say, well, yeah. And some people say, no, because Stanley called that a smoothing plane. Yeah, and if you really want to get into it, someday we can do a video on saws because those names get really confusing really fast. And Diston did exactly what Stanley did and pigeonholed a lot of the sizes and shapes. Even though that, some of them are kind of vague and some of them are very specific. Names are kind of a fun thing in language because they are what you make them. I hope this answered a few questions. If it didn't and you still have a question, throw that down in the comments down below. Send me a message and I will gladly answer that. If you want to send me an email with a picture of what is this thing, yeah, send that. I'll take a look at it and I'll let you know. But yeah, names, for some reason, they cause a lot of arguments, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a few people down there. It's not called that, it's called this, or I've always called it that, or I've always heard it called this. Yeah, it's because every tradition and every historical point had different names for different things. And so, yeah, there is no right or wrong when it comes to names. As long as the other person you're talking to knows what you're talking about, then that's what's important. So don't overthink it and don't worry about it. Kind of like a lot of other things in hand tools. Have a little bit of fun and enjoy the process. If you have any other questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, things I missed, things I should have added, let me know those down below. I do read through all the comments, and thank you. That does actually help out the channel. Anytime you comment down below, it helps us get in front of more people and helps the channel grow, as well as the like, comment, share, subscribe. Thank you. If you want to take it one step closer, there are a bunch of names scrolling over here. They are the patrons on Patreon. Without patrons on Patreon, we wouldn't exist. We are completely sponsored by the viewers. I don't take sponsorships because I want to say what I want to say. I don't want to feel like I have to say anything. If you like the content here and you want to see us keep going, think about becoming a patron, or you can become a member here on YouTube by clicking the little join button down below. Both members and patrons, we have special behind-the-scenes perks and other things like that. So if you want to see more of that, then, well, you know where to find out. I think that'll do it for now, and until next time, have a wonderful day. Bob, Michael, John, Joe, James, Robert, Sally, Micah, we have two Micahs, Micah L and Micah W,